I am Grandmaster Alejandro Ramirez, here to bring you a recap of Game 1 of the 2021 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Let's jump right into the action. The game started with the move e4, which is what most people expected, as it is Jan Nepomniachtchi's main weapon. The question was, what would the world champion answer? Would he go back to his trusted Sicilian that he used against Fabiano Caruana, or to his older paths with e5? And he quickly answered with the Spanish. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, came to another crossroads. People were wondering whether Magnus Carlsen would use again the Berlin defense that very successfully was used against Vishy Anand in those matches. However, a slight twist came on the board. Magnus played the move a6, and of course Jan quickly played bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, and off we went into the main lines of the Spanish opening. Bishop b3, castles, and the first twist of the game. The move h3 has become incredibly popular in the last few years. It's been a battleground for top grandmasters to avoid the dreaded Marshall Gambit that of course starts with the move c3 followed by d5. As many have pointed out, this has basically been beaten to death, and theory says that most of these games end in a draw. Probably Jan Nepomniachtchi's team also was unable to find any kind of advantage in this kind of positions and instead decided for the move h3, which has been seen very often, and it's normally met by one of two different answers. Bishop b7 is the most popular move in this position at the moment, and after d3, the sacrifice anyway of the pawn on e5 with d5 has gotten tons of attention. Basically, every top grandmaster at the moment is employing this system for the black side. However, Magnus had a completely different idea. Despite the fact that bishop b7 appears in over 4,000 games in the database, Magnus finds a variation that is really rare. And instead of playing bishop b7 in this position, he starts with a move knight a5, a move that's seen less than 50 times in the database, something incredibly rare, but that Nepomniachtchi certainly had looked at because he answered very quickly. Now, knight a5 is an intriguing move. The knight is not only going to the rim, but it does catch this bishop on b3. The question, of course, is who's defending the pawn on e5? And the only way to refute such a bold move, you gotta capture the pawn. Knight takes e5 was played relatively quickly. Knight takes b3 is the point. Black obtains the pair of bishops in this position, and as we'll see, also a slight edge in development, but we'll get to that in a second. Knight takes b3, pawn takes b3, bishop b7, the bishop develops, targeting this pawn on e4, the pawn must be defended. You could consider the move knight c3 to defend the pawn, but after b4, the knight is rather awkward. It doesn't have the d5 square to go to, as it is attacked twice. And if it goes anywhere else, the pawn on e4 is just going to fall. Therefore, d3 is certainly the most logical move. And now, black must strike while the iron is hot. d5 is an important move in this position to break apart the structure that white has established in the center and to give life to the pair of bishops that black has in this position. After pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, the players kept on playing relatively quickly. It did seem that Nepo, despite the fact that this is a very rare variation, was well prepared. The thing is, he wasn't as well prepared as the world champion. After the move queen f3, bishop d6, the Russian player very quickly played king f1. An unnatural move, but one that you play instantly if the computer that you're using has told you to play it beforehand. However, Magnus had one up on him. After king f1, Magnus sat down on the board and instantly played rook fb8, prompting the first big thing of the game. Now, rook fb8 is a very clever move in this position. Notice that there is this tension between the queens on the long diagonal h1, a8. However, black isn't really ready to take on f3 after the move king f1. The reason? The knight would simply retreat to f3, more or less consolidating white's position in a slightly more favorable manner than what happened in the game. After the move rook fb8, This bishop on b7 is actually defended, which means that black has really nice threats against this knight on e5. There's really no option here for white but to trade the queens on d5, in essence gaining black a couple of tempi. After some thought, Nepo decided to take on d5, knight takes d5, and this is an excellent time to take stock of the position. It's clear that black is still down a pawn, you can count them, but it's not easy to find a plan for white. Not only is white currently underdeveloped, this knight on b1 hasn't moved, the bishop on c1 hasn't moved, and also they are down the pair of bishops. But more importantly, in the long-term goals, it's not easy to see how these pawns on the queen side will actually prove to be superior to black's on the queen side as well. You want to create a passed pawn, but it's going to take a very long time to do so. Not only that, you can more or less understand visually when you see the position that white doesn't have the control over the board. In this case, he hasn't really crossed the third rank. Yes, you have one knight on e5, but it's kind of lonely in the center. Meanwhile, black has a ton of space. The pawn on b5 is a very good pawn, basically controlling the entire queen side. There's really no play on the king side, and white, despite not really having any weaknesses, is having trouble making progress, even from this position. Nepo plays a very logical move, in my opinion, the move bishop d2, just to develop his pieces, and instantly the move c5 came on the board. And it's not a surprise that Magnus had analyzed this position in depth. In fact, this position had already been reached twice before in two different correspondence games, and in both of them, white tried the move knight c3. However, Nepo was unaware of these games, and it's not entirely clear anyway that knight c3 is the absolute best move in the position. Instead, he chose a very solid approach. The knight on e5 is a tactical target in many variations. For example, after the move knight c3, knight b4, hitting this slightly weak and awkward pawn on c2. White sometimes wants to actually defend this pawn on c2 with the move rook e to c1 rather than rook a to c1. Why? Because this rook is already on a nice file. It's attacking a backward pawn on a6, and you don't really want to put it on c1 where it's passively defending a pawn on c2. So for this reason, Nepo decides, let's bring back this knight from e5 to f3. Let's try to consolidate my position, and only when everything is more or less defended, we'll reestablish our control in the center. Knight f3 was technically the novelty of the game, if you want to count the correspondence games. And even though many engines did give white a very slight advantage, it did seem that from a practical point of view, black has full compensation for the pawn. And black employs a very natural idea. Control over the center, control over the pawns, pressure the pawns structure on the queen side, and not let them advance. And for this reason, these rooks, they're not really well placed on b8 and a8. Instead, they're being brought to the center. Rook d8 to start, knight c3 as a development move for the white side, hitting this knight on d5. And of course, black is not interested in trading pieces in this position. He wants to keep pressure on the pawns. He doesn't want to simplify for absolutely no reason. He wants to keep pieces, keep the pressure up. Knight b4 comes on the board. The knight is attacking this pawn on c2, and again, it's the awkwardness of white's position. You need to defend this pawn, but you really don't want to. Rook ec1 is played. You can see how awkward this rook is on c1. And black plays the move rook c8, a multi-purpose move. You never know when the move c4 might come into the position. It blows up the position on the queen side and allows access for black's rooks to attack, again, that weakness on c2. Here Nepo thought for a little while and decided to start remaneuvering his pieces. The knight came back to e2, and we saw a little bit of dance of the knights. Notice how cool Magnus was about not having to rip apart the queen side. Instead, he just tries to control white from moving his pawns forward, and for this reason, he puts the knight on c6. The knight in many places was a tactical target on b4. Now there is no danger that this knight will come to e4, which, by the way, could have been met with bishop f8 and then a potential c4 later. And now that the knight cannot go to the central square, Magnus says, all right, I'll retreat my own knight, put it on c6, let's control more squares in the center. Bishop e3 seems like a very natural move, preparing maybe the break on d4, and again, Magnus maneuvers. Knight e7, a very nice move. The idea, the knight could come to f5 and harass this bishop, the knight could come to d5 and again harass this bishop, and it's difficult again for white to make progress. And it was probably at this moment that Nepo actually makes a serious inaccuracy. There were some ways of playing this position, for example, the move d4, knight f5, and here you don't really want to take on c5. Why not? Because I can take on e3 with check, pawn takes e3, bishop takes c5, and this pawn on e3, it becomes awkward, it becomes really backward and easy to attack for black's pieces. However, white did have the option of not taking on c5 instead of solidifying with the move c3, and you can see that the structure, it looks pretty nice. It's still going to be difficult for white to make progress. There's a lot of pressure in the center, the bishops are still strong, but if anybody is better, you would think it's white. A pawn, after all, is a pawn. In this case, however, Nepo rushed into simplifying the position, playing the move bishop f4, and quickly it seemed that despite being up a pawn, it was actually white that was in the defensive. After bishop f4, bishop takes f3, shattering the structure and changing the character of the position. Instead of having pressure against the queenside pawns only, Magnus takes advantage of the fact that many pieces are coming off and fractures that structure on the king side in order to be able to attack both the king side and the queen side at the same time. Pawn takes f3, bishop takes f4, knight takes f4, rook c6, defending the pawn on a6, and look at how beautiful this rook is going to be on the king side, attacking all of those weaknesses. And it was at this point that Jan actually thought, this isn't a great position. It's probably my task to equalize and draw this game rather than look for winning opportunities. And that was a very, very wise decision by the Russian player. I think that if white overpresses here, despite being up a pawn, he could very easily find himself in real trouble. He doesn't do so, however. He simply puts the rook on e1, the knight maneuvers to f5, c3, knight h4, targeting this pawn on f3. Again, it's these weaknesses that are giving white a big headache. Rook e3 was played, and king f8. A nice subtle move, avoiding this rook coming to e7, also getting rid of back rank problems without having to move these pawns. Why does black not want to move these pawns? Because you never know when this rook actually wants to come over to the king side and attack the opponent's weaknesses. Knight g2 was played in this position. Knight f5. You're not so happy as black to go into the pure rook endgame. Here, white is up a pawn, and even though most of the time it should end in a draw, it's not going to be so clear to immediately draw the game. Knight f5 is a much cleaner way of playing, keeping a powerful knight on f5, that's a blockading square on f5, and let's be honest, the knight on g2, not a great piece. Rook on e5, you gotta attack this knight with a tempo. If the rook went anywhere else, you could pick up d3. And after g6, knight e1, it's clear that black is not making any progress in winning the pawns, but white is certainly not making any progress himself in terms of activity. The knight is very passive on e1. The rook on a1 is not coordinating at all with the rook on e5 to target black's weaknesses. And despite the extra pawn, it's still a game that is more or less equal. And it's actually maybe even a little bit favorable for black. Why? It's just easier to maneuver everything around. The knight comes back to g7, and unlike this passive knight, this one is going to come to the king side with real threats. Knight e6, eyeing the f4 square. Rook e4, and a couple of maneuvering moves. f5, rook e3, knight e6. Don't want to allow this guy to go to f4 and attack everybody. So the knight returns to g2, and then a slight change of the position again. b4, a nice timed break. You don't ever want to play c4, making everybody backward and allowing this knight to come to d4 and to take on b3. And if you don't actually play the move c4, you definitely don't want to take on b4, but that means that you're just waiting for black to take on c3 and open avenues of attack against this pawn on b3. A very nice break here by Magnus playing the move b4, after which it is clear that white is not the one looking for an advantage. And Jan, recognizing this, decides, let's not push the issue, let's return the pawn and reach an equal position. King e2 is a smart move, moving the king to the queen side, where it's going to be a slight weakness after the move rook b8. Yes, you can't move the king all the way to c2, but it's going to be okay. King d2, b takes e3, b takes e3. Black gets his pawn back with the move rook takes b3, but the king is on time to prevent the rooks from coming into the queen side via b2. So the king is a good defensive piece, and this more or less equalizes the game. Even though there are some computer lines that give black a very slight edge, on a practical term, I think this is very close to equal. h4 is a smart move. The reason, you don't want to allow this knight to come to g5 and fork these pawns when the rook leaves e3. You want to move this rook down to e1 and maneuver to b1. And after king f7, which was a very logical move, rook e1, king f6, knight e3, rook d7, we reached a position that is really equal. Everybody has weak pawns. These are not great. But a6 and c5 are also very difficult to defend on a long-term basis. They're more of weaknesses than a strength. And after the move knight c4, rook e7, it was a tacit draw offer, as there is the possibility of playing knight e5, attacking the rook, rook d6, knight c4, repeating the position, and Magnus, of course, having no problem with the draw with black, said, let's just make that draw, play the move rook c6. The game was repeated a couple of times, and the draw was agreed. Certainly, in my opinion, a slight success for Magnus, who not only surprised his opponent, but also slightly outplayed him in the middle game. He got a draw, but also the better side of the draw in this position, never being in any danger at all. Jan needs to go back to the drawing board in this position and figure out a better way to try to put pressure in the weapon that Magnus is bringing with the black pieces, which is going to be the Marshall Gambit. We don't know if he might bring others, but at least the Marshall has survived this game, and more than survived, it's thrived. This was a great game by Magnus that just put him in a nice situation, an easy draw with the black pieces.